Hello everybody, welcome to our module on the cosmic game, exploring the frontiers of human consciousness, when we will look at some of the most far out experiences that people have in holotropic states of consciousness, when they are looking at some of the ontological, cosmological problems related to our existence. I will start by mentioning that the greatest experience that we had in the early experimentation with psychedelics was that number of the early subjects had in their sessions experiences that seemed to be indistinguishable from certain descriptions in the great spiritual literature of the world. Things that could be taken from the Vedas, the Upanishads, the books of the dead, and so on. Walter Pahnke's Good Friday experiment that I already mentioned actually subjected this to experimental testing in his Good Friday experiment, when he gave psilocybin to students of theology and the other half a placebo, using that questionnaire that he derived from spiritual literature and then work of Maslow and Stace. And he actually showed that these experiences phenomenologically were indistinguishable from what you find in this great spiritual literature of the world. And Tim Leary, Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner, when they were doing their experiments in the Hitchcock Mansion in Millbrook, New York, they were actually reading passages from the Tibetan Book of the Dead, Bardo Thodol, to people in psychedelic sessions. And they wrote their first book, which was focusing on the similarities that they found. It was called The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Now later it turned out that this was not always similar to Bardo Thodol, but that many people had experiences that were similar to other sources, like Egyptian Book of the Dead, or something from the European Ars Moriendi, the art of dying, medieval literature on death and dying, or from Islamic spiritual literature and so on. But there was this incredible parallel between the experiences that people were having and what you find in the ritual and spiritual history of humanity. And what happened is that this started a very heated discussion about what was called chemical or instant mysticism. What is this about? What does it mean? And it very quickly sort of separated into four different opinions. The first opinion came from the hardcore sort of materialistic scientists, who were very excited, and they say, well, here you have it, what the mystics consider some kind of a profound insights into the nature of reality is nothing else but alterations of body chemistry that intoxicate the brain, and then some stuff is coming and they sort of mistake it for some profound knowledge about themselves and the universe. So basically the idea was so much for mysticism. Now the other group said something very different, taking the position of the shamans of cultures that use psychedelic plants, visionary plants, as a major vehicle, as a sacrament in their ritual, spiritual world. And they say, no, what this really means is that there is a certain subgroup of chemical substances that are not ordinary substances. They are sacraments, This is what the shamans were doing. There's a group of plants that are special plants. Let's call them flesh of the gods, like they called Teonanacatl. There are expressions of divine energy, or there are deities themselves. Certainly the Amazonian shamans feel like that about ayahuasca, as being there is an entity that sort of comes through. Don Juan talked about Mescalito, entity that associated with peyote. Now there was a third interesting position, which was, as Walter Pahnke's experiment showed, the Good Friday experiment, and something that recently was confirmed also by people at Johns Hopkins, Roland Griffith and Bill Richards and others, that really phenomenologically you cannot distinguish the psilocybin experiences of those that are part of the world literature. And then the question arose, does similarity really mean identity? And does it mean that they have the same value? In other words, aren't they sort of pseudo-mystical experiences that really look quite like the real thing, but they don't have the same value? To have really a valuable mystical experience, it has come as a result of rigorous practice, asceticism, or as a response to prayer. So it's come as a grace, as a divine grace. This is not something that you can enforce by swallowing a pill. So then the question, whether these are really valid experiences was left to spiritual teachers. But unfortunately, the spiritual teachers did not agree, whether those are valuable or not. So there were people very, very violently opposed to it. The most powerful sort of opposing person was Meher Baba, who actually wrote a pamphlet which was called God in the Pill. He was saying that it's nonsense, absolutely impossible that you could sort of take a pill and have an experience of God. And he actually went so far that said, if the experience of God could be elicited by a pill, then it's not really very worthy God. There's an anthropologist, British anthropologist Zener, who wrote books like, it was called Zen, Drugs and Mysticism, who called this also pseudo-mystical experiences. Now, there were other people who really had a different opinion. I had myself the opportunity to be present in the session of a couple of Tibetan teachers, pretty prominent. And I had long discussions with Lama Govinda, who had himself psychedelic experiences. And they basically had the feeling that this is something that is valuable for the spiritual journey, but something that is, very tricky, something that has to be done with a lot of caution, because it's a very powerful approach. I had also the personal experience for sitting for a man. I can mention his name, Solon Wang, W-A-N-G, who was part of the circle of Chiang Kai-shek in Taiwan, who read my paper on the similarity between psychedelic experiences and the Eastern spiritual systems. And he actually traveled with his daughter all the way from Taiwan to Baltimore and determined to have a session. He was a Buddhist scholar who practiced for most of his life, and he never had a nirvana experience. He says before he died, he wanted to have a nirvana experience. And we talk German because part of the educational system, in China is more influenced by Germany than by England. And I was preparing him for the session. I said, well, you can, for example, experience something from your childhood. He says, not me, nirvana. I said, you can, relive your birth. He says, not me, nirvana. And I said, well, it's a little concerned because that didn't seem like a great attitude for a psychedelic experience. But then he had an experience that he considered as a Buddhist scholar, all-time practitioner, that he considered to be really experience of nirvana. actually coming down, he wanted another dose, and I couldn't give him another dose. And he said, I'll give you $10,000. He said, no, we don't do this kind of thing. And I can talk about it because he wrote about it in a book that there was this, two different opinions. Now there is the fourth category representing by one person, by Huston Smith, religious scholar, who actually had sessions with us in Baltimore. So unlike Meher Baba, he actually had personal experience and had something more to say about it than Meher Baba, who misunderstood really. He thought that what we were saying is it's a guaranteed experience. If you swallow this pill, you're going to have experience of God, which of course is not the case. You have a spectrum of experiences in psychedelic sessions. One category is you can have an experience of mystical union, but you can also have experience of going to hell, or going to hell before you go to heaven. So he didn't understand that. He saw this was like we are saying it's a guaranteed. You swallow the pill and you have the experience. So he himself thought that it needed a kind of enlightened person like himself for people to have a mystical experience. Now, Huston Smith was actually personally present in that Good Friday experiment as one of the observers. So not only had he, the personal experience, but he was part of this Spanky experiment. And his position was that, yes, these mystical experiences induced by psychedelics are indistinguishable from those that are described in spiritual literature, but the value that they will have in your life depends on other kinds of factors, the set and the setting and the intention. So if you are a spiritual seeker who is doing regular practice and you read, you have some sense for the spiritual literature and so on, then you have sort of like the right kind of terrain for that. You have that experience and can really accelerate and can mean a lot. Now, if you go to Berkeley to a party and they're serving fruit punch, and a jester comes with a handful of sugar cubes laced with acid and throws it there, and people think they are drinking punch, and suddenly they are hit. And even under those lousy circumstances, they have good fortune that they have mystical experience. It's going to be totally out of context, and it's probably really not going to be very, very useful for them. Actually, when we did our work with alcoholics and addicts, we had special programs for that in Maryland, in the Psychiatric Research Center. We thought initially that when people have the peak experience, the mystical experience, that they will stop drinking. This was based on the success of the Native American church with peyote. A lot of the Native Americans get alcoholics because they lost their territory, they lost their faith, and so on. And they had tremendous success rate in peyote ceremonies. And we also had a statement by William James, who said the best treatment for dipsomania, which is an archaic term for alcoholism, is religiomania. If people have a spiritual conversion, spiritual experience, they tend to give up drinking, which is known. But it didn't happen. Significant number of our patients had the peak experience, but in the follow-up, not all of them stopped drinking. And we couldn't figure out from the results of the tests what was the difference, until we found the difference was that those who actually remained sober, they had the feeling that they now saw the way how they can lead their life, but understood that they have to do something. They had to get a zip code, they had to get a job, and so on. Whereas those who went back to the drinking, they thought that just having the experience, God is going to do it for them. They don't have to contribute anything personally. Okay, so now back to this. So I went through several thousand of these reports from psychedelic sessions, and I was looking specifically on those parts of these reports when people were asking some kind of fundamental questions, which were ontological, ontological questions about the universe, which is something that I didn't lead people to. And people came for therapy, but somehow in the course of those sessions, most of them became more interested in philosophical spiritual quest than being concerned about their symptoms. The symptoms, were being treated sort of, but became almost like a secondary thing. The primary was now to find out who they are and what it is about. So they were asking questions like, how did this universe come into being? Is it really just a product of inanimate, inert, and inactive matter that created itself, or was there some kind of a superior intelligence that was involved? Was there a plan? Was there a, if you want, design? What is the source of order in the universe? What is the source of meaning in the universe? What is the source of form in the universe? Because you have to be pretty I don't know what the term would be, not to see the artistry in the universe. It starts with the beauty of nature, the Arctic, the Polynesian islands, and so on, and the incredible beauty of animals and people and so on, and the art that is created, So not to see that there is more than just, the material out of which the universe is created, which is what the concern of materialistic scientists is. Like, if they explain, the composition of atoms, that they understand creation. Rupert Sheldrake was talking about this very much. Where does form come from? Where does meaning come from? You can have certain amount of sand and stone and wood and glass, and you have a choice to make a castle, to make a tenement house, to have a church. And if you just pay attention to the material, you will have no clue why one became one or the other. So this is a major question. So these are the kinds of questions that people were asking. How do we come to terms with such problems as finiteness and infinity, or eternity, and so on? The kind of questions that we ask when we are 14, maybe, or 12. Like there's something strange with this thing. Where does this end? And you cannot imagine that it ends. We can't imagine that it doesn't end. We ask, where did it begin? We can't imagine that it began. We can't imagine that it didn't begin. So these are the kind of questions that emerge in the psychedelic sessions automatically. It's not as geared towards philosophical or spiritual quest. It's really therapy automatically turns into something else. Other question, is there an intelligent supreme principle, God? And if there is, what is my relationship to this principle? What is the relationship between matter and consciousness? Why is evil in the world? How do we explain that? Who are we? Where do we come from? Where are we going? Is our existence limited to one lifetime, or is there a whole series of... So those are questions that emerged, and that I specifically, in this research that I did, I focus on those several thousand of these reports, and looking specifically on those parts where people were answering these kinds of questions. So what came out of this? So there were certain experiences that were really related to the spiritual quest. Many of my patients and other subjects said that they maybe started the sessions with a different intention, let's say therapeutic and so on, but that in the process it turned into a spiritual quest. So the question was, if this is a spiritual quest, is there some experience that we have the feeling that we arrived, that we, achieved what we were sort of going for? So I started looking from that perspective, and I found that there was a very significant experience that you can call experience of the immanent divine, where people look at the world and suddenly it was not an ordinary material world, but they had the direct perception of this being a work of creative cosmic energy. Or they started seeing unity behind or under the world of separation. So they had direct perception, that there is cosmic creative energy. And even matter sort of stopped being matter and became a kind of an energetic expression. Now, in these kinds of experiences, transpersonal experiences, they found out they can identify with anything that in ordinary state of consciousness we perceive as an object. So you can become an eagle and see the world the way an eagle feels. You understand. You have a body image of an eagle. You understand how you fly, how you work the air currents, for example. You can become any other creature. You can experience yourself as a caterpillar going through metamorphosis. You can experience yourself as a whale, and so on. I had an experience of becoming a sequoia tree, where for all practical purposes my body image was that of a sequoia tree. I was experiencing photosynthesis. I was experiencing the connection with the earth, getting the water, getting the light of the sun. And then it all started becoming sort of mythological. It was not just what I knew from botany. And then I started becoming aware of the longevity, that this thing has been there 3,500 or 4,000 years. When you see in the Sequoia Park, the cut, and there's a little piece from the surface, it's Columbus discovers America, and then Jesus crucified, and you realize that thing was there through all that. And then it became to me like a sort of Buddha figure in an immovable spot. It's there where this sort of mercurial life is happening. Species come and go, and dynasties are created and destroyed, and so on. A fantastic experience where suddenly the whole world was alive somehow, and was something that I could directly experience. I could identify with. I could become. In other words, so I understood. We understood at this point several things. One of them was the worldview of animism, where the native cultures really believe that everything is conscious. The river is conscious, the trees are conscious, the mountains are conscious, and so on. And also the understanding of what is the basic tenet of the esoteric system, which is each of us is a microcosm that somehow contains the macrocosm. As above, so below, as within, so without. That's what was found on the emerald tablet of the Hermes Trismegistus originally, but then became major tenet of the esoteric systems like Tantra, certainly the Gnostic system, certainly Kabbalah, and the Adam Kadmon, and so on. So the understanding that somehow we can experience the universe in two different ways. One is going out through our senses, physical senses, and observing and analyzing and then synthesizing and getting certain idea about the universe. But there is a whole other way of a perception, which is you go inside, and then as you reach a certain depth within yourself, then this mysterious flip happens. Some of my patients talked about this being similar to what you find in Maurice Escher's art, or other people say it's like a multi-dimensional Möbius strip. When you take a strip of paper, you turn it 180 degrees and glue it, and then you go from the surface, and before you know, you're inside. So the inside and outside gets mixed. And so you go down then, and suddenly this flip happens, and you're experiencing the world at large, but you are not experiencing through your senses, but through some kind of an inner representation. So then you understand, when the mystics say something like, I know I'm an insignificant part of the universe, but I am also the whole universe. So when I'm talking about this as being just a part of it, I am talking about what science is interested in, what you can weigh and measure. If you put me on a scale or you measure me. If I talk about being the whole universe, I talk about my capacity to experience myself as anything that is in the universe. So that's about information. That is not about matter. If I become an elephant, I understand what it is like to be an elephant. I get the information. I don't become an elephant in the sense that when you put me on a scale, it's going to be 3 tons. It's going to be substantial, but not 3 tons. The same when I say we are separate from each other, but we are all one. Okay, it doesn't make any sense. So, traditional scientists would say, don't you know Aristotelian logic? You cannot be a part of the whole at the same time. Well, you can. And we didn't really understand it until holography came. That holography can show you how that is possible, how a hundredth of a hologram can actually give you a significant part of the content of the information of the whole. Okay, so those were some of the things that happened. Definitely were significant steps on the spiritual journey in this immanent divine. But people did not have the feeling that they arrived, that this is the end of the spiritual journey. There was something beyond it, and that turned out to be what's called the transcendent divine, as compared to the immanent divine. When you see the nature as God, Baruch Spinoza, Deus sive natura. So this is a situation where now another reality that is normally not perceptible unfolds, to use the terminology of David Bohm, unfolds into this reality. So suddenly, you are in heaven or hell or paradise, and suddenly you are encountering Virgin Mary or Jesus or Shivanatha Raja and so on. So what happens here? You encounter the world of the archetypes, of the Platonic archetypes. You realize that there's a realm that is superordinated to this one, that in a sense forms and informs what is happening here. Now, in that world, there are incredible energies, much more energies, unless you talk about tsunami or earthquakes and stuff. I mean, these figures there, the images are endowed with enormous energy, and there is a certain kind of a linear time. You can experience sequences, archetypal sequences. There is a certain kind of archetypal space. You can see that things are happening in the space. So you can experience something like the battle of the Olympian gods and the Titans, or Ragnarok, the doom, the twilight of the gods and so on. There's some sequences. But what is missing in this kind of archetypal world is cohesion. Now, for sitting here, and I think about, let's say, San Francisco and Prague, I can say which direction Prague goes, how far it is, how long it gets to get there. If I talk about the Bolshevik Revolution and the French Revolution, I can say how many years elapsed between it. You cannot say how far is it from Olympus to Shiva's heaven. Or you can't say, how much time elapsed between, the Ragnarok and some other sort of mythological events. Now, people who have these experiences, they are amazed by the emotional power of these kinds of experiences, which go usually way beyond what we experience here, both ways, either ecstatic rapture or terror, depending on what the nature of these experiences is. But again, people don't have the feeling that, or at least when they integrate it well, they don't have the feeling that they reach the absolute. Actually, there is a very great danger that Joseph Campbell talked about when he said a useful deity should be transparent for the transcendent. If you encounter these archetypal images, they should point to something beyond them, a source out of which they come. If you make them opaque, you start worship these figures, these images. He said it's idolatry. And it's very dangerous because you are in a space which unites people who are willing to see it the same way and worship the same way, but at the same time divide the world. They set you against another group, like we are Christians and all the rest of you are pagans, and we have to convert everybody to Christianity or there is no place for them. Or, you know, we are Muslims, you are infidel, let's go and do sacred war, let's go into jihad. Or, you know, certainly Christians and Jews had the same kind of a relationship. So it's a very, very dangerous kind of a form of religion, this kind of organized religion that doesn't go far enough. And in spiritual journey that makes a lot of sense is one that you see through the archetypes. You ask about the source out of they all came, and it's just an expression of the playfulness and the tremendous creativity of the source, that it doesn't create one religion. You know, it's something very interesting in each of the religion. The symbolism, the worship, the iconography. It would be really boring if you had just one religion, or if you had just one language, if you had just one form of music. I think creativity goes for the multiversity. You want the richest possible expression. So again, if it's well integrated, people who had powerful experiences, they don't have the feeling that this is the ultimate. So the question is, what kind of experiences people had where they really had the feeling that they arrived? Okay. So I found two experiences like that. One was where the supreme principle was experienced as an incredible source of light. But when people describe it, they say, this is the best I can do, but it was much more than light. I mean, there's a transcendence of polarities. You cannot say whether it's demonic or whether it's divine. It seems to have a certain personality, characteristics, possibly even sense of humor and so on. It's just an incredible situation where, like, all of existence, or at least potential for creation of everything, is just all concentrated into this kind of source. And again, you can experience it in two different ways. One is that you are encountering the source, but you keep the distance. You still have the subject-object dichotomy, which would be like the sixth chakra attitude, where it could be felt as a kind of filial relationship, father or mother, God, or like the Bhaktas or Saint Teresa of Avila have it as a lover, God as a lover. Or then the next possibility, when you just don't maintain separate identity and you just really dissolve. So the second example would be, for example, Sri Maharshi, who was certainly the partisan of this dissolution of the non-dual situation. And he wrote a little poem that sort of characterizes it, about a little sugar doll who went to the ocean and completely dissolved. And Ramakrishna, who was a Bhakta, he kind of responded to it, and he says, I want to taste sugar, I don't want to be sugar. So he wanted to maintain that separateness, to experience the source in that way. Now there's another type of experience that people also saw as the ultimate, and that was, paradoxically, was the void, the experience of a void that has to be distinguished from just being empty-headed or sort of not experiencing anything. There's a sense of kind of a cosmic, so some people can say supracosmic or metacosmic void, where you have the feeling that there's nothing there, but nothing is missing. Like everything exists in the potential form. There is an experience where there is enough energy and enough intelligence to create a universe, but it's not happening. It's there in a potential form. But you have the feeling that that's where even existence comes from. It comes from this cosmic abyss, from this amazing source, cosmic source. And there's a difference between the Eastern perspective and the Western perspective. When we had an ITA, the International Transpersonal Conference in Kyoto, there was Ayao Kawai, who was a Jungian, a Chinese Jungian, and we were having the conference, and there was some conflict happening. There was some conflict happening between American businessmen and Japanese businessmen, and he was watching it and he was laughing. He said, they think if they have a translator that they understand each other, but they would have to have a translator and an interpreter. And we said, how come? But imagine that you have a discussion between Newtonian physicists and quantum relativistic physicists. They would be using terms like matter, and it would be translated. But the content of it for what is matter is different for the Newtonian and the quantum physicists. And he said, you in the West, you have a worldview where there is a power center in the center, at the core. So it's God, you see, and then you have a pecking order of angels, whatever virtues, principalities, angels, archangels, and so on, cherubim wheels, and then you have the world of animals. You have sort of the crown of creation is humans, and then you have higher and lower animals. Whereas what we have a worldview with a hollow center, where creation emerges out of the void as a complete creation, so that any kind of hierarchy is relative. I mean, a worm has equally valid place in that composition as the king. They're all, part of a meaningful gestalt, and the sort of, each of them plays a meaningful role. And so then you create a certain kind of a background, meta framework, where things, even if they sound similar, are really something different. So that was a very interesting. So we have those two sources of creation or ends of the spiritual journey that people were talking about. Again, people independently, people who with sessions independently didn't communicate with each other, and came with these kinds of conclusions. So what happened really is that a completely alternative understanding of the universe emerged, which was on the one hand very much like what Aldous Huxley described in his perennial philosophy, you see, where all the different bits and pieces of experiences that people had fit together into an integrative worldview that was radically different from the one that we have in the West, and was similar to the different systems of perennial philosophy, but also increasingly converging with the new scientific worldview, the new emerging paradigm, starting from Fritjof Capra, going to Karl Pribram, the holographic model of the brain, to David Bohm, the implicate-explicate order, to systems theory, Erwin Laszlo, and so on, Amit Goswami. So this was fascinating. So when I'm describing it, I'm not saying this is the way it is, but it's interesting that in these non-ordinary states, you can come with a radically different worldview that is very logical and consistent in and of itself, and you can get experiential confirmation for different tenets of that particular system. So the other thing that happened is people had difficulties describing it, and I think I already mentioned that the more educated, more sophisticated tend to use terminology from the Eastern spiritual traditions, talking about Maya and Samsara and Nirvikalpa, Samikalpa, Samadhi and Kensho and Satori and those kinds of things. Or they actually frequently come with poetry, with transcendental poetry. So they talk about, Omar Khayyam or Kabir or Princess Mirabai or D.H. Lawrence or Rainer Maria Rilke or Yeats or Walt Whitman and so on. That the poetry somehow is more conducive to conveying the mystical experience than if you use sort of everyday language. Now, there's another very fascinating aspect to this, that when people had that experience of the source, of the creative source, it was understood suddenly, intuitively, that this is the source of creation, this is the author of creation. And then they were asking questions, why creation? Because if you are on a spiritual journey, you think if you get to that place, it's going to be fantastic. So if that source is already in that kind of state, why bother? Why to go through this, complicated play of creation? What is the motivation with capital N? Not kind of like our motivation, but what moves that source, to this incredible process of creating worlds and levels of reality. And people give various kind of answers, very interesting. Some of them emphasize the incredible resourcefulness, the incredible abundance that is present, that is contained in that source, so that it somehow has to put it out, has to give it out. It's like, I had some biologists who said this is like when you watch a cell under the microscope and there's a tension and suddenly there are two, and you see the divisions happening and you start the embryo coming. There's that incredible abundance that is present, that wants to express itself. Another thing that was that there is just this enormous potential in the source, and that the divine wants to get to know itself in a sense, and the only way it could be done is to express it in some kind of, as long as it's sort of in this larval, undifferentiated situation, it's very difficult to really get some sense for it. So it has to be expressed so that the divine can look at it in a sense, through its own creation, through the part of itself. So in medieval Kabbalah, they say that creation happened because face wanted to see face, because God wanted to get to know himself, herself. Another kind of situation was the kind of immense curiosity and playfulness and fantastic experiment. Sort of, some parallel to what we see here when you have an artist who feels pregnant and wants to put it out, or a scientist who feels the drive to explore how things are, and so on. So this would be all sort of like a higher octave of what we see on this level. All those attributes would have to be written in capital letters to distinguish it. Now the other part was emphasizing the opposite, that actually it was not overabundance, but there was something missing that the creative principle was looking for. One statement that was very common was loneliness, that the creative principle is immense, but it's alone, and that there's a craving for partnership, for relationship, for giving love and receiving love, need to share. Another interesting one is that the source is infinite and eternal and kind of ephemeral, and that it's craving for something that is tangible, that is concrete, you see, that is finite, that is limited. And this was expressed very beautifully in a picture from from Codex Borgia that is showing two figures dancing, and one is Ehecatl, who is the Quetzalcoatl spirit in the form where he's representing also air and breath, and Tezcatlipoca, who is called smoking mirror, who is representation of matter. And you can see like the matter, Tezcatlipoca, craving to become Quetzalcoatl, and Quetzalcoatl wants to become tangible, wants to become Tezcatlipoca. So it's this dance, between the eternity and finiteness and ephemeral nature and concreteness and so on. So some people really saw it that way. The other thing was that experience of the source is fantastic, but it's always the same. So there is a monotony. There's not much happening. This is also expressed in a very kind of interesting way in Kabbalah. That one of the statements was that God created the world out of boredom. To have something happen because not much was happening. And again, this would be boredom, with capital B. It's not like when I get bored. So this was the why creation, where people ask why does that incredible source bother to go through that whole unbelievable process of creation. Now the other one that people were asking, it was the how of creation. How is it done? Okay. And there would basically, again, people one after another saying you have to start from unity, from oneness, and there is a process of partitioning, a system of separation, dividing, when the one becomes many. So there are these divisions of the original unity and creating sort of a multiplicity of forms. In the first step, something like closest to the source would be the entities of the archetypal world, and then the next one would be the realm where we are living, when somehow the creations from the archetypal world become like templates for what is happening here. Now this has been for centuries an argument in philosophy between two schools who had different opinions about Platonic forms or ideas, and they were called nominalists and realists. The nominalists were saying, well, the archetypes, they are just names. Nomen is name in Latin, so nominalists. They are basically abstractions from what we see in the everyday world. So if you have the archetype of the Great Mother Goddess, this is something that is an abstraction of the qualities of individual mothers that we know from our life. Or the world tree is an abstraction that is made from concrete trees. Now this other group, with very unfortunate name, realists, says no, this is not true. There is a domain in which these have ontological quality. They actually exist. There's a realm normally invisible. This is inhabited by these entities, by these archetypal forms, so that something like the Great Mother Goddess is actually like a template that from which the creative energy is channeled into individual mothers. It's like a recipe how to make individual mothers. Or the world tree then becomes, something that has many different inflections and becomes the different variations. But there's a principle, this archetypal principle of a certain kind of branching that you find, in the individual ones. And this work with holotropic states definitely supports the position of the realist. I mean, you have no doubt when you have that experience of the archetypal world that this is not something that you are making out of your everyday experience of trees or mothers. I mean, there is a different kind of energy. There is a different level of abstraction that world really comes alive. When I was 12, 13, my mother took me to meetings with Paul Brunton, who was a British philosopher who spent some time with Srinamana Maharshi in the Arunachala. And he became like a popularizer of Indian philosophy. Wrote books like Secret Teachings Beyond Yoga, Pilgrim in Himalayas, and so on. He also went to Egypt at one point. And he had followers all over the world, and my mother became one of them. And she took me there, and I became instantly fascinated by, they had books, Thakur, Aurobindo, and Maharshi himself and stuff. And I became instantly fascinated, started reading. I actually finally ended up taking Sanskrit when I was studying medicine. I just couldn't meditate. He gave a kind of a darshan, and then we had to meditate. I was all fascinated, all inflamed by the literature, but he says, who wants to sit? There's so many interesting things to do. So I never could meditate until after my psychedelic sessions. But I had this fascination with Indian philosophy. It was beautiful. I was taken by it. But I had the idea that, this was like the situation was these people in India didn't have much to do. They were sitting on the Ganges and they were spinning these interesting stories. I had no idea that you can meet Kali or become a Nataraja. So this was tremendous surprise for me, how I realized that I was already under the pull of these archetypes when I was attracted to Indian literature, or philosophy and so on. So this is one aspect of the how of creation. One becomes many. Many of different kinds. So there's divisions and there's differentiation that is happening. And then there's another process that kind of comes in, which some people describe more in psychological terms. It's like divine forgetting or something, that these split units of consciousness somehow forget that they came out of the same source. Aurobindo's definition of an atheist was a god who is playing hide and seek with himself. It's like the extreme where you're not only separated from the source, but you specialize in denying that the source even exists, But this kind of degree of forgetting of one's own source, where you come from, alienation from that. So some people talk about dissociation, about forgetting. Some people use more kind of a gross kind of metaphor, like it's a partitioning or separation and so on. But basically, this is those are the two aspects. There's the why, as we talk about it. Why does that source create? And then the other one, how is that happen? What is the process of this creation? Now there's also this situation that kind of remains, which was described already in this Avatamsaka Buddhism, the multiple penetration, that in some sense each of those parts in a sense contains all the others. So in Jainism they had the concept of the jivas. All parts of creation were these split units of the cosmic consciousness, of the original consciousness, that were self-deluded into believing that they were autonomous, that they were sort of individual and they were separate. But at the same time, they all had the information about the others. So this was the original idea in Avatamsaka. This was also the concept in Jainism. And in German philosophy, it came with Wilhelm Gottfried Leibniz. He wrote a book called Monadology, where again the creation was made of these monads, and each monad had an information about all the others. So when we started looking at optical holography, when it became available, those were now the predecessors. These were the new sort of heroic systems that already had the foretaste of what a kind of holographic universe would look like. The next one is the image of the Gnostic man from the Gnostic tradition, where each human being is really an archetype that contains all of creation in some sense. And I have another picture here, which is from Kabbalah, which is Adam Kadmon. Again, the idea that one human being contains somehow the whole universe, which means not in a physical sense, but the information and the potential to become anything that is part of creation. And I have two tantric images. Tantra is very interesting because it can portray things in two different ways. One is totally abstract form, when you just use geometrical patterns. So this first one is the image of the human being, which is called Purushakara Yantra, where the central part is the realm where we live, and then above are the different supernal levels, and then below are the underworlds. And then the next picture is when it takes a semi-figurative, semi-geometrical form, and then finally it becomes something that's totally figurative. This is a picture that I chose for the cover of my book on the cosmic game, which is inspired by Bhagavad Gita, where Arjuna is asking Krishna to abandon for a moment his human form and show him his real cosmic nature. And he does it, and then he has become this cosmic being. Again, when you look at it, the central part around the belly is the world where we live, and then you can see the different sort of higher supernal levels of reality, and then you see the underworld. This again, we are talking about the microcosm, containing the macrocosm. Okay, so basically the way these patients saw the universe, somebody had a great revelation about it, some others were getting it bits and pieces and putting it together, but ultimately when I looked at it, different people actually arrived at the same kind of worldview. The way we would arrive at similar worldview if we use our senses, we would have some significant amount of agreement what we are dealing with. So they saw the creation as coming from the source, ultimately from the void, that then manifests this source that has the kind of a luminous quality, as I talked about it. And then you have the divisions and the partitioning, the dissociation, until you end up with very complex worlds that have many, many different entities. Like here, people of different races, different colors, a lot of animals, a lot of plants, and so on. These people, on the basis of their experiences in holotropic states, see out of these two great processes happening. One is moving from the original oneness into the world of multiplicity and separation and alienation. And then in the same system, you have processes that make it possible to undo, somehow transcend the separation, and moving towards bigger and bigger wholes until there is a possibility of melting again, with the source of creation. Now, this was called in Neoplatonic philosophy, but Plotinus called it efflux and reflux. Aurobindo called it evolution and involution. Ken Wilber talks about it as descent, ascent, and my own terminology is holotropic and holotropic. Hele means matter, so holotropic is that movement of consciousness into the world of matter, and then holotropic is that movement back when we are searching the original wholeness. Now, we saw two major mechanisms that sort of open up the realm of transcendence. It's possible to express it actually in astrological terminology, archetypal astrology. But one of those ways is, we would say, Plutonic, where you go through a difficult journey, kind of what Jung called the night sea journey, what the shamans go through, the death, rebirth experience, which is a kind of Plutonic. Some mystics get to the point where they are on the end of the rope. Everything seems to be end, and then suddenly they break through. That would be a Plutonic one. And Rick Tarnas and I, who've been watching the transits of people in these states, we see that it's typically associated with planetary transits of Pluto that people have. And the second one is more Neptunian, where it's not about death, rebirth, but it's about dissolution. Let's say an example would be, I talk to people who would take a raft trip on Colorado River through Grand Canyon. And you are there on the raft and you look up, there's a 1 mile of these incredible formations. They even call them Vishnu and Shiva schist. And you kind of look up there and you see the sky above that, and suddenly your boundaries are kind of melting, and after a while you don't know where you end and where the river begins, or the raft and you and the Shiva schist and Vishnu schist. And there's no struggle. It's just kind of a Neptunian type of a dissolution. So those are the two major ways to reunion. Now, the next very interesting thing is, I mentioned the Hindu idea. We are not Nama Rupa, we are Atman Brahman, Tattvam Asi. Our true nature is divine. I mentioned Teilhard de Chardin. We are not human beings having spiritual experiences. We are spiritual beings having the experience of being human. Now, if this is true, if each of us is really identical and commensurate with the cosmic creative principle, how do we account for the intensity of conviction that we are, limited human being? How can that happen, that we are not realizing, our own true nature, that we get sort of alienated from it? And Alan Watts wrote a very interesting book which was called The Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, when he's asking this question. So again, I was looking into it. I was trying to get answers from people, how they saw it in their psychedelic sessions, in their holotropic state of consciousness. And the most interesting experience that I had was somebody who came into our program for scientists. We had possibility to give sessions to scientists for insights. And he was in a place where he started seeing creation as a Leela, as a divine play. And, saw it's coming from the source and so on. And was asking this question. And we were in Baltimore. And he said, the way I understand it, the trick in this is to put into creation the ugly, the repulsive, the trivial. He says, if we were these ethereal beings, you see, floating in the air and taking the energy directly from the sun, and we look one side and there's Grand Canyon, and then there's a aurora borealis or sunset over the Pacific, and we listened to Beethoven's and Bach's music, it would be just too obvious that this is a divine realm and we are divine beings. So he says, so what do we have? Now, I think they have done a lot of work now to improve Baltimore, but when I came there, it was a shock coming from Prague to Baltimore. It's a really ugly city, miles and miles of these streets, with ugly black and red houses. And so he said, so what do we have? Baltimore, these ugly streets, people living their sort of ordinary lives, belching, farting, this sort of the lavatories, with obscene inscriptions. We have junkyards, we have all the body odors and body imperfections and so on. And pornography, foul language, urban ghettos, polluted industrial areas, and so junkyards. He says, and then the divine is just giving sort of in small dosages, but the existence of this ugly and repulsive gives us the belief that this cannot be a divine realm. How could something like this be, divine? And then you can add to it what we see in the world, the behaviors and the wars and stuff like that. So people were giving me different reasons of obstacles for seeing divinity in creation. So one of them was the predatory nature in life. Life feeds on life. Joseph Campbell interpreted from Tantra the image of Kali, who is cutting off her head and feeding actually herself and her devotees, as being image of life. Life is feeding on life. You cannot be alive without this being at the expense of another living being. Joseph Campbell used to say, my definition of a vegetarian is a person who is not sensitive enough to hear a potato scream. It's really not that people spoil the world. It's all the responsibility of people. I mean, you look at things that people have very little to do with, like a tsunami or, earthquake, thousands of people killed, volcanic eruption, Pompeii, and so on. You look at Africa; those are scenes hard to watch when you have, pride of lions coming and getting a zebra or something, sort of the blood and guts and so on, and you imagine what it is like to be in that kind of situation where something can get you every moment and eat you. So this is not something that people created, and it's really built into the creation, which makes it quite difficult to really embrace enthusiastically creation. Anthony Leeuwenhoek said, "Life lives on life. It is cruel, but it's God's will." Lord Tennyson said, "Nature is red in tooth and claw." Biologist George Williams said, "Mother Nature is a wicked witch." Marquis de Sade actually referred to the cruelty of nature as a justification for sadism, for his own behavior. Alan Watts wrote a very wonderful piece that was for a Playboy, which was called "Murder in the Kitchen." Basically, looking at the situation, you cannot be alive without this being at the expense of another creature. And so he was asking, what is the solution for this? And what he says, it's in doing it with reverence. Sort of, this is what the Huichols were doing, for example, who do deer hunt. They kill the deer, and then they have a ritual when they ask for forgiveness, and then they thank. Now, this is a very different attitude to something that people do in safaris and so on. We have near Prague is a castle called Konopiště, which was the castle of Ferdinand d'Este, who was the heir of the Habsburg dynasty, who was killed in Sarajevo, and this became the motive for the First World War. Now, he was a hunter. He supposedly killed 300,000 animals in his, like on the safaris, and that the whole castle is just trophies. Unbelievably obscene. They have trash cans that are made of elephant legs, and fly swats made of elephant tails, and it's all, the heads of the zebras there, and all these other animals. That whole castle is just full of these trophies. They have hangers, like antlers and stuff like that. And then he was killed himself, of course. So that's certainly one of the things that makes it very, very difficult to embrace creation. Now, Erich Fromm wrote a very interesting book, which was called Anatomy of Human Destructiveness, where he basically talks about the fact that human aggressiveness is even worse than the animal aggressiveness. Animal kill for food, might be competition, sexual competition, or defending territory, but you don't find useless, sort of unnecessary violence in nature that would resemble what we are doing, like concentration camps and Stalinism and things happening during the Cultural Revolution in China and so on. So this is a great problem. Why is evil in the world? So some people were sort of asking this question and trying to find some answer. So again, one of the interesting ways of looking at it is if you look at the statement of Ramakrishna, when Ramakrishna was asked, Swamiji, why is evil in the world? He was thinking for a while, and then he said, to thicken the plot. I sort of read it. I said, thicken the plot? What are we talking about? 2-year-old children dying of leukemia or being killed by napalm or ending up somewhere in Syria and stuff during these battles. What are we talking about? And then I was thinking about it a little more. And they said, well, let's do kind of a transpersonal sanitation of creation. Let's imagine that there is none of that shadow side is there. We have really a clean universe. So we start from, let's say, diseases. Obviously, diseases, a lot of suffering, bad things, shadow side. Well, let's imagine a world without diseases. Everybody is healthy. Now, you can't do it in an isolated fashion. There are a lot of things goes with it. So we also lose the healers, the shamans. We lose the history of medicine, all the good Samaritans helping suffering people. We don't have Mother Teresa with her Nobel Prize and so on. We don't have the fantastic discoveries, antibiotics, transplants, and so on. These kinds of interventions. So we lose a big part of the story, and then we go to violence. Nobody should be violent. People should be nice to each other. Taff Sparks, who is leading our training, is a movie fan, and he writes screenplays. And so when he started writing screenplays, he brought me a book, how to write a screenplay. And he said at the beginning would be, if you want to have a guarantee flop at the box office, you create a movie about a village where nothing bad happens. Everybody loves everybody else. We would not go to see that kind of a movie. So what kind of movies are we looking for? So the idea is there has to be polarity. You cannot have really a world without polarities. It gets some depth to it when you have the dark side, you know, like you appreciate sunrise and the warmth that come with it because it's coming after the dark, cold night, or you appreciate your health when it comes after the disease. It gets a different meaning to health than when it is something that's guaranteed. So the same with aggression. So we cannot do it in a separated way. So imagine that nobody was ever violent. So we lose all these situations where there was a battle, there was a war, and so on. You also lose all the history of not only of the aggression, but of the heroism of the defenders, people who were fighting for freedom against dictators and so on. You find all that sophistication that went into creating weapons and the defense against weapons. We would not have any of the burgs or the castles in, fortified castles. They would all be instantly disappearing. We would lose all the literature that had to do, no Tolstoy, peace, War and Peace, and so on. All the movies that have any kind of violence in it, which would not be so bad, but not much would be left of the Hollywood archives and so on. Then the kind of amusement that comes from the military parades and so on, the uniforms of different countries, of different historical periods and so on. So all art, all paintings that were inspired by it. So I started seeing, there has to be polarity. I mean, there's something about the thickening of the plot. But then the gut feeling was, does it have to go that far? Can't we would it be okay if it's like a little narrower? But if you look at what's described in Kabbalah and so on, that the divine would not really get to know its full potential if it would not express it in some way. I mean, if it would be holding back. And, if it's also a situation where death is not real, nobody really dies, we are talking more about experiences. And in a sense, as we talked about it, the divine, everything that exists is really some embodiment of the divine. Everything is Brahman, that takes many different forms. So in some sense, the creative principle is doing it to itself. There's a wonderful poem by Thich Nhat Hanh who says, I am the girl who was raped by the pirate, and I am also the pirate who raped the girl. I am the caterpillar who got eaten by the bird. I am also the bird who ate the caterpillar, and so on. So this is a very, very kind of a complicated question, but it's one of the major tasks. Most of the difficult task in the spiritual quest is to be able to embrace creation with this unbelievably heavy shadow side, and this is something that a lot of people in the psychedelic sessions or in the holotropic breathwork really struggle with. How do you reconcile, the love for creation, love for the universe with all this enormous shadow side. There's also the pitfalls. There's the quest for transcendence presents some major obstacles, some major challenges. So the way to reunion is fraught with a lot of hardships, challenges, intrapsychic as well as external. So there are a lot of frightening experiences, like the ego death, which is a major step on the spiritual journey, is a very scary experience, and very frequently the opening is associated with it or preceded by encounter with the worst evil entities. This is beautifully represented in Nara, for example, when they have the largest Buddha figure that has ever been created. And when you walk into the hall where you have this Buddha figure, there are these horrifying guardians sort of, at the door. So you are confronted these horrifying figures, and then you sort of you walk past them, and suddenly it opened into this more beautiful Buddha figure. And this is really reflected in the inner experiences. Frequently before this major opening, you really experience something quite terrifying, including the ego, that sense of total annihilation, a confrontation with evil forces and so on, as the step in this spiritual journey. Some of those experiences, like we talk about the second matrix, it's fear of insanity, fear of death, fear of dismemberment, and so on. So they're pretty horrifying steps on the spiritual journey that can deter quite a few people to actually go through it. But then we have also external obstacles. So in the Middle Ages, this was the Inquisition. There was the Holy Inquisition, Holy See, that was determining what are acceptable experiences and what are not. So I'm absolutely convinced that there are a lot of those people who were having spiritual experiences that the Inquisition didn't like, and so blamed it on witches and devils, and they behaved worse than the Satanists when they were treating the people who were accused of Satanism or witchcraft. Supposedly, the estimate was that like 3 million people were sacrificed in the auto da fe's and tortured to death during that time. Now we don't have Inquisition, but we have psychiatry, who determines what are really acceptable experiences. We actually, for the first presentation then we get on spiritual emergencies was in a place called Denver's, which is part of Boston. And it's what was Old Salem. And the conference where we presented was there at the time when there were these trials, where the story is that the girls there in Old Salem had a sort of nanny who came from Barbados, very likely was teaching them some shamanic techniques and so on, and the Christian community was seeing it as witchcraft and so on, and again, people tortured and killed and so on. And this was the conference where we were presenting. It was at the place when these trials were happening, and right across the valley there was a sort of really old psychiatric insane asylum where they still were doing electroshocks and all those kinds of things. Was like the modern version of what was happening, in the Middle Ages. You have this. You have these kinds of external interventions. There are, mystics in many countries are persecuted. They're sort of not part of the organized religion. They're in conflict with this, and historically, some of them were killed. Christian missionaries killed a lot of the shamans, a lot of the local healers, destroying the local spirituality. Then we have the interesting situation with psychedelics, where you have a tool that can really open you up spiritually very quickly. But that would be too easy. So before you knew, there was the question, that whole scare about, which turned out to be nonsense, about genetic damage. If you take LSD only once, you have a deformed baby. With this whole created thing. What Anslinger and his people did about marijuana, the reefer madness, all those horrible posters and movies and so on, which are total lie. That a lot of people paid for very much by ending up in prison and so on. The misrepresentation of marijuana, for example. But then also, very quickly after psychedelics came, you had the question of prolonged reaction. You had the question of flashbacks, people killing their mother-in-law or looking into the sun and losing sight and so on, all those sort of horror stories, which make it a little more difficult to use those tools, for spiritual advancement. You have sex, something that in Tantra can be used as a vehicle for enlightenment, but it's also something that has a lot of pitfalls that can sort of screw up, complicate people's lives. So the ambiguity about sex as a potential vehicle for spirituality, but also something that can get you into really bad trouble. Okay, then we have a certain dilemma of the spiritual quest, which is when we are on the spiritual path, what we are craving for, where we are going, is the union with the divine. This is the ultimate, okay? Now, when we have that experience, we realize there is a problem because this is where the creation comes from. Now, if that state were just perfect, creation would never happen, which means something was missing in that undifferentiated state. That became a motive, if you want, for creation as we talk about it. So there's like not a solution on either side. I mean, if you are identified with the divine source, then there is this push or pull towards creation. When you end up here in the world where there is impermanence and death and so on, then there's a craving to go back. In Kabbalah, this is expressed in the Star of David. It's a 6-pointed star, where it's people reaching for God and God reaching for people and so on. So what is the solution? I mean, for that, there's no really finality to either side, to either sort of dissolve in the source or being here as part of the multiplicity of the created realities. So those people that I saw solving this problem in some reasonable way, they decided that this realm has something significant to offer. In religions like Christianity, but you certainly find it in Jainism and in the original Hinayana Buddhism. This is the garbage level. This is the samsara. This is the valley of tears. And as long as you are sort of incarnate, there is a problem. You want out of here. You want into nirvana and so on. Now, in Buddhism, the original, great vehicle, this the small vehicle, the Hinayana Buddhism, the idea was that as long as you are incarnate, you are in the realm of suffering, and you basically want out. You want into the realm which is beyond existence. The term nirvanam is derived from the Sanskrit vata, which means wind. It basically means evanescence. It means blowing off the torches of light. So basically the idea is to go beyond the realm of existence, I mean physical existence. And then historically a different, larger form of Buddhism developed, which is called the Mahayana Buddhism, the great vehicle, where there was a very different perspective. In Mahayana Buddhism, the Tibetan version, Vajrayana, it's expressed with the famous picture of the wheel of life, which is showing the Lord of Death holding the wheel of life in his grip. And there are 6 realms, 6 lokas, which are different realms into which we can be incarnated, or which we can also experience as part of our training, Buddhist training. You don't have to wait until you die. You can experience them where you are practicing Buddhism. So this is the Devaloka, the realm of the gods, and the Asura Loka, the jealous gods, and then you have the hungry ghosts, the Preta Loka, you have Niryaka Loka, the hell, and then you have Tiryaka Loka, the realm of wild animals, and then Manaka Loka, the humans. But then in the middle of that circle, there are three animals that represent what the Tibetans call the poisons, the three forces that keep us on the wheel and actually perpetuate suffering in the world, which is the pig, representing avidya, ignorance. There is the rooster, representing desire leading to attachment. And then you have the snake that represents anger, aggression, and so on. And in Mahayana Buddhism, you have the idea that actually you can achieve or you can move towards nirvana to the extent to which you can reduce the influence of these three forces in your life. I actually give a talk when I'm showing how responsible use of psychedelics can help you to overcome ignorance, anger, aggression, and the desire, the attachment, and so on. So this is then the way that you can sort of approach this, when you can embrace somehow the creation, that there is something that this level has to offer. This is the only level where you can experience love. This is the only level where you can have children. This is the only level where you can experience, Beethoven's or Bach's music, or some beautiful theater or movies where you can go visit incredible countryside, Polynesian islands, or going to the Arctic, or whatever you do, experience scuba diving somewhere in Virgin Islands, the most beautiful under sea scenery and so on, or experience bouillabaisse or baked Alaska, or whatever your things. It's incredible adventures in consciousness that you can experience here, which would not be possible if we are in a completely undifferentiated form. Now, but to be completely committed to this, believing that this is all that you are, which is basically a physical being, a Newtonian object, a highly developed animal. This brings a lot of suffering, a lot of the concept of impermanence, the fact that death comes, and so on. So the alternative seems to be something that Jung also recommended, that you dedicate part of your life to some kind of a systematic inner quest, when you don't just respond to the problems in the world, but you reserve some time when you now do some kind of really significant inner exploration. When you, in the Jungian terminology, you connect with the self, you get the wisdom of the self, or you overcome, some of these forces that I was talking about, the sort of transcendental ignorance and violence, anger, and the sort of overwhelming desire, the greed, and so on. And you somehow discover your true identity. You discover that you are, on the deepest level, you are Atman, Brahman, rather than Nama Rupa, to use the terminology. And that creates a kind of meta-framework, which makes it possible for you to deal with the daily experiences. So you can experience what this realm has to offer without all the very painful, unpleasant experiences that come from the total identification with the physical form and the existence in a physical world. So this creates a very different perspective on life, and also to do the spiritual journey. You have had experiences which had such depth and were so difficult then the kind of problems of everyday life, you know, seem pretty trivial as to what it can get like when you really hit some of the dark places. So there's also a training for endurance of you know, you have a different capacity to deal with it. So when we had the conference in Prague, the International Transpersonal Conference, Ram Dass was there, and they asked him, you know, we talked about the situation in the world, that you know, are we going to survive as a species? Are we going to make it, or are we going to be destroyed? And Ram Dass says, well, you know, this would not make much difference in terms of how I approach it. And they say, what do you mean? Well, you know, I think that if I'm involved in the spiritual journey, I do the best that I can contribute to a better outcome of the situation. This is my contribution. But at the same time, it gives me the endurance. I mean, if this is really end of the civilization, which we would not be the first civilization that destroyed itself, and you know, they didn't have anywhere the kind of means that we have for that. If it is really the end of this civilization, if this is Kali Yuga, you know, I will be prepared to face it with a little more equanimity than if I did not have all that experience, all that spiritual practice. So anyway, so this is a nice way to ending this excursion. And again, you know, those would be really interested in reading in some details. There is a book which I have wrote, which is the same name, Cosmic Game, Exploration of Farther Reaches of Human Consciousness. So again, thank you very much for your patience, and we'll be looking forward for our next connection.